Throughout the 1970s, the video game market had been on the rise, with both arcades and home consoles widely popularizing the electronic entertainment medium. The dawn of the 1980s, however, brought with it a new type of game that would intrigue and entertain players: the platformer genre. While early arcade cabinets like Space Panic and Crazy Climber were instrumental in building the foundation for platformers, it was Nintendo's massive hit Donkey Kong with its introduction of a jump button that truly popularized them. Platformers continued to grow in popularity throughout the 80s, with Nintendo once more helping to solidify their importance in 1985 when they released Super Mario Bros. For the Famicom home console, which became the golden standard for the genre, inspiring nearly every title that came after it. As platformers continued to pour into the market over the years from countless developers, they all generally had one big thing in common. Each had a dedicated jump button. With dozens of developers jumping into the platformer craze, one employee at Capcom had a different idea. What if that jump button were to be taken away from players and replaced with a different type of movement to traverse across stages and obstacles? This employee was Tokuro Fujiwara, a young developer at Capcom who had already begun to make quite a name for himself, and this game would be titled Bionic Commando. The Bionic Commando series would begin its life in arcades, then later branched out onto many home consoles and handhelds across the next few decades. This Capcom series would often change developers throughout its lifecycle, with many of its sequels and remakes being handled outside of the company. While the look and style of the franchise changed regularly, one thing generally remained the same. Its focus would remain away from jumping, with the spotlight on its unique swinging and grappling mechanics. This is the history of the series that tried something more innovative and different within the platformer genre. This is the history of Bionic Commando. In 1982, just 1 year after Donkey Kong had taken arcades by storm, a young Tokuro Fujiwara had been recruited out of college by Konami, a company that at this point was very well established in the video game industry with big hits like Frogger and Scramble. While at Konami, Fujiwara worked as a designer on just 2 titles, Puyon and Roc'n. His first title, Puyon, was a 2D shooting gallery game based on the fable of the Three Little Pigs, but Fujiwara had joined development after it had already begun its planning stage. His next project though, Roc'n, he was able to work on from the very start. Roc'n was an arcade game which utilized a rope and grappling hook that let the player traverse vertically up various platforms with the goal of reaching the phoenix-like rock, a mythological bird of fortune, at the top of the stage. Cavemen and dinosaurs blocked the player's path and would need to be avoided or stunned to continue proceeding upwards to the level's goal. Despite the massive popularity of platformers like Donkey Kong, Roc'n wouldn't give its players the ability to jump. They would instead be forced to strategically place their rope and grappling hook to carefully climb up while avoiding foes. While working on the game, Fujiwara struggled with the amount of memory he had to work with on Konami's arcade board, and many of the ideas for how the player could further utilize their in-game grappling hook had to be shelved. These ideas were never thrown out though, and he would retain them along with many others for potential use on future titles. After Roc'n hit arcades in 1983, Fujiwara left Konami and moved to a brand new company called Capcom, who was looking to break into the video game industry and were recruiting young designers. In 1984, Capcom's very first video game, a vertical shooter designed by Tokuro Fujiwara called Vulgus, debuted in arcades. The title did well for the company and Fujiwara, who continued making games at Capcom. It was in 1985, however, when he found true success, creating not one, but 2 of Capcom's biggest games yet. The incredibly challenging platformer Makaimura, known as Ghosts and Goblins in the West, and a top-down military shooter called Senjo no Okami, translating to Wolf of the Battlefield in English. Both games found immense success, not only in Japan, but also throughout the rest of the world. when Senjou no Okami was localized for Western arcades, its name would be changed to Commando, and instead of playing as a nameless soldier like in the Japanese version, its main character would be given a name, Super Joe. The game was a huge financial victory for Capcom and led to many other companies directly copying its gameplay, most notably SNK's Ikari Warriors, which released the following year in 1986. Commando and Ghosts and Goblins made a huge impact, igniting an explosion of popularity for Capcom games, with Fujiwara as one of the main creative sources fueling this acclaim. He then created Rush and Crash in 1986, an arcade title with a post-apocalyptic setting that mixed car combat with top-down Commando-esque shooting gameplay. However, when the game was later released in North America as the Speed Rumbler, Capcom's localization team strangely renamed the main character, much like Commando, to Super Joe, though this was only in the game's instruction manual and not quite as front and center as Commando's marketing had been. After Rush and Crash, though, Fujiwara had a desire to return to his roots and create a follow-up to his 1983 Konami arcade title, Roc'n. Technology was moving fast, and he was confident that he'd be able to make the type of game and implement the mechanics he had originally imagined back in 1983 without the hardware limitations that held him back. Roc'n was owned by Konami, so a sequel was obviously out of the question. Instead, he doubled down on the military theme of Commando, although with a more cartoonish look and some light science fiction elements. For this new game, Fujiwara was adamant about not including a jump button, since he felt players would become too reliant on it. So, similar to Roc'n, the only way to ascend platforms and clear gaps and pits was to use a grappling hook. This would be no simple hook and rope though, but instead a full bionic arm capable of shooting in 5 different directions. Once the arm was attached to a platform, the player could either pull themselves up on top of it, or if they attached it diagonally, they could swing and release themselves into the air to cross gaps and obstacles. While players would need to use their gun to defeat enemies, the bionic arm could be used to push them back and stun them, a helpful tactic especially in situations where the player felt overwhelmed. The game consisted of 5 different stages, some of which had very minor bosses that would need to be overcome to proceed. Fujiwara and his team spent much of development working on the game's graphical assets, with many being created and unfortunately later scrapped. One big example was the large, semi-functioning red robots found in Stage 3. One of these robots was originally intended to reappear in the final stage, swinging its arms around and firing lasers at the player, but this boss needed more fine-tuning than what the team had time for and was removed as a result. Harumi Fujita would compose the title's incredibly catchy soundtrack, with its Stage 2 music eventually becoming known as the series' main theme. The game hit Japanese arcades in March of 1987 under the title Toppo Shikreto, or Top Secret as it would be pronounced in English. Later that year, it was released in Western regions under a new title, Bionic Commando, and performed incredibly well, perhaps even more so outside of its native country. Strangely, when the title was localized for North America, its main character's sprite was redrawn to look less cute-like in its design, and the game was now referred to as a sequel to Commando, and to a lesser extent the Speed Rumbler, with its arcade flyer having text that read, "Super Joe is now Bionic." This was obviously done in an attempt to capitalize on Commando's massive success overseas. In Japan though, the 2 games, Senjou no Okami and Top Secret, were completely separate from each other, with radically different titles and no shared characters. As time went on though, the distinct lines separating the 2 series started to become a bit blurred, especially once Bionic Commando received a new sequel. Not in arcades, but for Nintendo's now incredibly successful home console, the Famicom/NES. Initially, Capcom had been focused on creating arcade games. They had ported some of their more popular titles to Nintendo's Famicom, known as the NES in the West, but many of these ports had been handled by third-party developer Micronix. The Famicom's popularity had grown at an insanely fast rate though, and Capcom could no longer ignore its massive success. In 1987, they would bring Famicom development in-house, creating a sequel to their pirate ship Higemaru arcade game called Higemaru Makaijima, and a brand new IP titled roc'n, known as Mega Man, outside of Japan. The experiences in these new console games were purposely much different than the ones found in Capcom's arcade titles, expanding out to often be longer games with more in-depth mechanics and content. As the company shifted more towards development for home console games, Fujiwara continued to work on arcade games like Tiger Road and Ghouls and Ghosts, but Capcom slowly began to push him towards Famicom development. The company planned to do a hard split between their development teams, with one division focused only on creating arcade games, and the other solely on making home console titles. Fujiwara was adamant about wanting to continue focusing on arcade games. Developing for consoles meant that there would be no location testing before game launches, and that he'd constantly be working with inferior hardware compared to the latest arcade boards. The higher-ups at Capcom eventually won out, convincing Fujiwara to focus on home console games full-time. Despite his protests, Fujiwara had ironically already started development of a game for Nintendo's Famicom, a sequel to his arcade hit Top Secret, or Bionic Commando. In Japan, this new sequel would be titled Hitora no Fukatsu Top Secret, translating roughly into English as Resurrection of Hitler Top Secret. The story saw classified Nazi documents detailing a plan they had never fully completed called the Albatross Project, falling into the hands of the Imperial Army. The Federation forces sent in Super Joe, the hero of the first Top Secret, to retrieve the documents, but he was captured by the enemy. Rad, or Rato Supensa, as he was named in the Japanese game's instruction manual, would be the playable main character, sent in to infiltrate the Imperial Army, rescue Joe, and complete his mission. Rad later found out during the operation that the Imperial Army was attempting to, just like the game's title implied, resurrect Adolf Hitler to help complete the Albatross Project. One of the most interesting parts of the game's plot was the Japanese version adopting the West's Super Joe name as being canon in Top Secret's lore, the first shift of many to come for the series. This sequel would feature very familiar gameplay to its predecessor, but done so on a much larger scale with more freedom of movement. The player could now shoot their bionic arm while in the air, allowing them to constantly keep swinging ahead while airborne. New weapons and items could be collected from levels and equipped, like a rocket launcher, a machine gun, iron boots, a bulletproof vest, and many more. The player would start the game with a single hit point, much like its previous arcade outing, but as green canisters were collected from downed enemies, Rad's hit points would steadily increase over time. This gave players the option of simply farming enemies early on to greatly decrease the game's difficulty. There were two types of stages found in Resurrection of Hitler: action-oriented levels like those found in the first Top Secret, and neutral zones that had no enemies and acted as locations where the player could gather information, learn more about the story, and collect certain items. If Rad fired his weapon while in these neutral zones, he would be attacked by a non-stop onslaught of enemies until he either was killed or chose to evacuate. The action-oriented stages in this sequel now had mid-level communication rooms that would require a certain type of communicator to allow Rad to either contact his Federation allies or listen in on enemy communications. Utilizing these rooms would generally open locked doors in the stage required to progress, while also giving the player game hints and advancing the story. If the wrong communicator was equipped or had not been collected yet, Rad would have to leave the stage until he had the correct one in his inventory. Almost every level had the exact same objective: destroy the immobile Imperial core, which was pulled straight from the final stage of the arcade game. This core was usually guarded by Imperial soldiers or a boss enemy, though these could all be ignored if the player simply avoided them and focused on the core instead. Both level types were represented on a large map which the player could navigate with their helicopter and then descend into which area they hovered over. It would sometimes encounter enemy convoys represented by green trucks. When this happened, Rad would move to an overhead ground battle that featured gameplay nearly identical to Commando and let the player earn continues for when they ran out of lives. With the Japanese canon adopting Super Joe's Western given name and these commando-like overhead encounters, it started to feel as if the marketing choices made overseas for Bionic Commando's arcade release had started to infiltrate the top secret series in Japan. This all somewhat made sense though, given the title's large success in North America and Europe. Hitora no Fukatsu Top Secret, released on the Japanese Famicom in July of 1988. Unfortunately, the game did not sell or review very well in its native country, leaving Capcom to prepare the game for its North American release. Nintendo of America's notorious censorship policies would require the game's localization to remove and alter many of the game's graphics and text. The Nazis were now referred to in-game as the Bads, and all swastikas were changed to an eagle-like logo. Adolf Hitler was renamed to Master D, Emperor Wiseman was now called Generalissimo Kilt, and Rad's name was mistranslated as Lad. Despite being completely scrubbed of all Nazi references, the game's ridiculously gory end sequence that depicted Hitler's head exploding frame by frame was oddly left intact, even if Hitler himself wasn't. Finally, some of the enemy placement and stage designs were adjusted to make things a little easier for this upcoming Western version. The game made its way outside of Japan and onto the NES in North America in late 1988 and received a big push from Nintendo Power magazine that seemed to help boost its sales and popularity. It would be called simply Bionic Commando, just like its arcade title, and made no attempt to communicate that it was actually a sequel. The game then made its way to most PAL regions roughly 2 years later in 1990. Bionic Commando's console release marked the end of Tokuro Fujiwara's involvement in the series, though he would continue working at Capcom for many years to come, overseeing many of their larger franchises and even creating the Resident Evil series. This would not spell the end for Bionic Commando, however, as the franchise would still march onward without Fujiwara at the helm. The same year that Bionic Commando on NES landed on European shores, Capcom released a sequel to Commando for arcades. In Japan, the game would simply be titled Senjo no Okami 2. When it made its way to Western regions, however, it would drop the Commando moniker and instead be called Mercs. The title featured very similar gameplay to the original arcade hit, but now allowed for 3 people to play together simultaneously. Its 3 selectable characters were Howard Powell, Thomas Clark, and Joseph Gibson, or as it was safe to assume at this point, Super Joe. The West's marketing influence had now moved into the Commando series, even in Japan. This connection between the 2 series would become even greater solidified by another game, but more on that later. 2 years after Mercs hit arcades, the Bionic Commando franchise finally made its way to a handheld console, debuting on Nintendo's incredibly popular Game Boy in 1992. The Western influence on the series would continue on in this game, with even the Japanese version dropping its top secret title and adopting the Bionic Commando name instead. Rather than create this game in-house, Capcom hired Minakuchi Engineering, an uncredited third-party developer who also handled many of the Mega Man games on the Game Boy. For years, Minakuchi Engineering's involvement was uncredited, but composer Koji Murata confirmed their involvement decades later on his website. Bionic Commando's portable outing went with a new futuristic sci-fi setting and gave its characters more anime-style designs. It would act more as a remake of the Famicom/NES title than a completely brand new experience. Just like in its previous game, Super Joe was sent by the Federation to gather intel on the Albatross project being built in the Durais territory. During the mission, Joe was captured by the enemy. Rad, now officially named Rad Spencer for the first time in English, was then sent in to finish Super Joe's mission and stop the Albatross project in his place. The gameplay was nearly identical to the home console version of Bionic Commando. Players would move their helicopter around a map, generally alternating between visiting action-oriented stages and neutral zones while collecting new items, weapons, and communicators. Rad could still encounter enemy vehicles on the map, but rather than the Commando-like gameplay in the home console version, these would change to simply more side-scrolling levels filled with enemies. The first half of the game felt almost exactly the same as Bionic Commando on the NES, but as players moved into the second half, they'd find new original stages and bosses that were added to help set the game apart from its predecessor, making it feel a little less like a remake. Probably the most welcome addition, though, was the ability to change communicators and weapons while in the communication rooms, alleviating the need for the player to exit the level completely if they had brought the wrong communicator with them. A password system was also introduced, allowing players to experience the game in more bite-sized sessions on the go. Bionic Commando's Game Boy version launched during the summer of 1992 in Japan, before making its way to the West later that year. It's unclear how well the title performed for Capcom, but gaming magazines at the time gave it plenty of coverage and positive review scores. Regardless, the series went dormant for a while before reappearing again years later, once more on a portable screen. After the Game Boy version was released in 1992, it would be 8 years before the Bionic Commando series would head back into battle. In 1998, however, Nintendo formed a new development studio in the United States called Nintendo Software Technology, or NST. NST was founded by Claude Comer, Scott Sumada, and Nintendo of America president Minoru Arakawa, and was created in partnership with Comer's private university, the DigiPen Institute of Technology. The new studio would employ both gaming industry veterans as well as many DigiPen graduates and had the full backing of Nintendo. NST's very first project would be for the wildly popular Game Boy Color handheld. Surprisingly, the studio was even allowed to create this project utilizing an existing franchise. It would not be a Nintendo franchise, however. While it's unclear how the agreement materialized, NST's first game would be a new entry in Capcom's long-dormant Bionic Commando series. They would create their own take on the fan-favorite platformer under the title Bionic Commando Elite Forces. Elite Forces adopted a similar futuristic sci-fi setting found in its predecessor on the original Game Boy, though it did not seem to be linked in any way canonically. Unlike its earlier portable title, this game was not based on any of the previous titles in the franchise, but it did pull plenty of inspiration from them. As had become pretty predictable at this point, Commander Joe, presumably Super Joe, reported from behind enemy lines about a massive weapon being prepared called the, you guessed it, Albatross. The Bionic Corps would be sent in to rescue Joe and put an end to the Albatross project. Rather than Rad Spencer being the main character though, players could choose between either a male or female soldier and input a custom name for them. This decision wouldn't change much about the overall story or gameplay outside of a few of the levels being a bit different. The map navigation, commando-like enemy encounters, health level-ups, communication rooms, and inability to jump all remained intact, keeping the title feeling very familiar to those who had already played other entries in the series. Elite Forces added plenty of new features though that helped set itself apart from the previous games. One of the most notable new mechanics was a sniper mode. In certain areas of a stage, a target icon would appear over the player's head, allowing them to switch to a first-person sniper view and take out enemy soldiers. If the player succeeded in killing all enemies within a certain amount of time, they would be rewarded with medical supplies. Elite Forces also added in much more challenging and varied boss fights, the ability to drop down through platforms, and even included some additional secret levels. While Bionic Commando's previous Game Boy title had a password system in place, this title came with a battery backup on the cartridge that allowed players to save their progress either in the mid-level communication rooms or after defeating a boss. The development of the project was a major grind for the studio. The team spent much of their time just creating the tools to be able to build the game. Even with the title being developed for the Game Boy Color's vastly inferior hardware compared to modern home consoles, they strived to capture the same fluid animation found in games on the PlayStation and Nintendo 64. Rather than just a few frames of animation per action like in all of the previous Bionic Commando games, NST would give the characters many more frames, simulating more fluid motions and pushing the limits of the Game Boy Color's hardware. Bionic Commando Elite Forces launched exclusively in North America and Australia in January of 2000, completely skipping Japan and solidifying its place as a fully Western-focused series. Outside of a few outliers, the game received very positive reviews from critics, who praised its impressive graphics and animation, challenging gameplay, and quality of life improvements. While this would be the studio's first and last game in the series, NST continued to create games for Nintendo over the years, like Pokemon Puzzle League, the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series, and Metroid Prime Hunters. Bionic Commando Elite Forces was received quite favorably by both fans and reviewers, but that wouldn't prevent the series from once again taking another long 8-year hiatus. Rad Spencer would make his triumphant return though on the 7th generation of consoles with a game that finally brought the character into 3D. While Bionic Commando wouldn't officially return until 2008, many years after its Game Boy Color entry had hit store shelves, the gears for its revival actually began to turn in 2004. In Capcom's Japan offices, a young American at the company named Ben Judd expressed interest in heading up a full 3D reboot for the franchise. Judd had worked at Capcom's Osaka branch for a few years in their localization department, contributing to series such as Mega Man, Beautiful Joe, Resident Evil, Devil May Cry, and Dead Rising. He even provided Phoenix Wright's iconic voice in the original Ace Attorney trilogy. In 2004, Judd approached the top brass at Capcom with a design document and pitched a reboot for Bionic Commando, citing how many other series like Metal Gear Solid had successfully transitioned from 2D to 3D. Capcom unfortunately declined his pitch, but Judd persisted. By 2005, he had become close with industry veteran Keiji Inafune while working on Dead Rising together. Inafune had worked at Capcom for nearly 20 years at this point, and had even taken over the role of overseeing the Mega Man franchise once Bionic Commando creator Tokoro Fujiwara had left the company in the mid-1990s. Judd continued to push his reboot pitch to Inafune, and eventually his persistence won out. Development on a new Bionic Commando began at Capcom in mid-2005. This new take on Bionic Commando started its life as a title developed for Sony's PlayStation Portable handheld, though after some time working on an early build of the game, Inafune felt it would be better suited for Microsoft and Sony's next-gen consoles, the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. With the game setting its sights on Western audiences, Inafune and Judd felt it would be best handled by a Western studio. After visiting multiple developers, they eventually decided to give the project to Swedish studio Grin, who had proven that they knew how to implement in-game physics quite well. After some talks though, one project slowly turned into two. By this point in time, Bionic Commando hadn't received a new release on a home console in almost 2 entire decades. Both Grin and Capcom came to the agreement that it would be best to do a 2D remake of the fan-favorite NES game to reintroduce the series after its long hiatus before its larger budget full 3D counterpart was released. Judd would act as producer on both games, coordinating development and communication between Capcom in Japan and Grin in Sweden. Simon Wiklund would act as both the creative director and music composer for the NES remake. It was eventually titled Bionic Commando Rearmed, and it would be created using Grin's in-house diesel engine. Wiklund had been a massive fan of the original home console title, regularly playing it throughout his childhood and even into adulthood. While Wiklund loved the game, he did not think it was perfect and had ideas on how it could be improved. Probably the biggest change was that rather than forcing players to complete the same boss objective over and over by simply destroying the core at the end of the level, Wiklund and his team added many new bosses which the now fully named Nathan Rad Spencer would need to defeat. Simply firing your weapon at these new bosses wouldn't be enough though. Instead, Spencer would need to use his bionic arm in strategic ways to reveal and attack the boss's weak spots. The Flying Albatross Fortress, which acted as the final boss in the original version, now became an entire full new stage at the end of the game. The title also introduced brand new upgradable weapons like the shotgun and vector cannon that, unlike in previous entries, could be changed on the fly instead of only in communication rooms or between levels. The weapon strengths were more balanced as well in this game, since the rocket launcher had been severely overpowered in the original. Additionally, Spencer's bionic arm was now much more versatile, able to grab and throw barrels and enemies as well as use them as shields. The communication rooms would return, but now required the player to play a 3D minigame guiding a ball of light to a special cube when hacking the enemy network. Finally, challenge rooms were added that could be found in the neutral zones and in certain hidden locations that tested a player's swinging abilities beyond the main story. The gameplay wasn't the only thing to see some major changes though. Rather than using sprite art like in the original version, Grin would now render everything in the game into full 3D, though its classic 2D gameplay still remained intact. The team tried to match the NES game's color scheme and style as closely as possible throughout its many stages. Spencer was redesigned to look even more out of the 80s, with Grin's artists taking inspiration from Top Gun's Iceman and Back to the Future's Marty McFly, and Super Joe was given a more American cowboy-like look. New characters were also added, like Haley, who piloted Spencer's helicopter around the map, and the Imperial's Gottfried Groder, another bionic soldier who faces off against Spencer as a recurring boss. Incredibly popular SNK and Capcom artist Toshiaki Mori, better known as simply Shinkiro, would be responsible for creating all of the in-game artwork seen during its cutscenes and dialogue sequences. Bionic Commando's Western influence would truly come full circle, with all versions of Rearmed doing away with any Nazi imagery, and the Western localization now being accepted as canon. The story and characters felt much less serious in their tone, giving Spencer a snarky attitude and making playful references to the original NES game's poor translation. Hitler would still be in the game, but he would now be referred to as the leader in North American and European versions. Strangely, the Japanese version adopted his original Western localized name, referring to him as Master D. Aside from that, Super Joe's full name was revealed to be Joseph Gibson, the same name as the main soldier in Commando's sequel, Mercs, solidifying the canonical connection between the two series and tying everything together. This canonical connection was established despite a third game in the Commando series titled Wolf of the Battlefield Commando 3, releasing just 2 months prior to Rearmed, which dropped Super Joe Gibson and went in its own direction. Lastly, Rearmed added in 2 local multiplayer modes. A co-op mode where 2 people could play through the entire campaign together, and a competitive mode where up to 4 players could face off against each other in various types of competitions, like Deathmatch and Last Man Standing. Neither of these modes had been planned for the game, but one of Rearmed's programmers had messed around a bit with the concept of adding simple multiplayer, just for fun, and the team thought it worked well, eventually deciding to keep it. Unfortunately, since it hadn't been a planned addition, the team did not have time to add any online functionality to either mode. Bionic Commando Rearmed launched as a digital-only title in August of 2008 for Xbox Live Arcade, PlayStation Network, and Microsoft Windows. Unlike the series' previous outing, this game would release in Japan, but ditched its top secret name once more, and was titled Bionic Commando Master D Fukatsu Keikaku, translating roughly into English as Bionic Commando Master D Resurrection Project. A very trimmed down Java version of the game was also released on cell phones around the same time that featured sprite art and felt much closer to the original NES game than its new remake. Bionic Commando Rearmed received almost unanimous approval from critics, who praised how much it improved on the original game while still preserving what made it such a great experience in the first place. Some even went so far as to call it quote-unquote the ultimate video game remake and quote-unquote the best downloadable game to date on Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network. The game was a hit, selling more than 100,000 copies in its first week alone, an impressive number, especially for a digital-only title around this time. With Bionic Commando Rearmed impressing reviewers and making waves in the media, people's eyes began to shift to its 3D counterpart being developed alongside it. But would it live up to the lofty expectations that Rearmed had now set up for it? The success of Bionic Commando Rearmed proved to Capcom that there was still plenty of interest in the series that Japan had written off, which left fans wondering if Grin could repeat their success with the upcoming 3D reboot of the franchise already in development. The Western gaming market at this time was quickly growing larger and larger, to a point where many Japanese video game companies could not ignore it anymore and began experimenting with projects that attempted to cater more to audiences outside of their home country, and Capcom was no exception. While Rearmed had leaned towards a more quirky and sometimes silly approach in its presentation, Grin's other project would be the exact opposite. This 3D reboot was simply titled Bionic Commando, making it the fourth game in the franchise to have the exact same name. Ben Judd acted as the game's producer, with Keiji Inafune taking the role of its executive producer, and Grin's Ulf Andersson overseeing development as the title's director. Rearmed's creative director, Simon Wiklund, also lent his talents to the game, overseeing all of its audio as lead sound designer. Judd, Inafune, and much of the team assisting from Capcom's Japan offices regularly visited Grin's studio in Sweden, exchanging ideas and working through design problems over the course of about 2.5 years of development. The main focus for the team was getting the swinging mechanic, Bionic Commando's defining feature, to feel right, in addition to adding in more verticality to the game, like scaling giant buildings. They wanted players to feel like Spider-Man swinging through a city, and this had been already done in previous games, primarily through a single button press. Bionic Commando would be different though, requiring additional player skill but providing more nuanced control while swinging with the bionic arm. The game would be a third-person shooter at heart, but Grin and Capcom believed its unique method of traversal and abilities would help set it apart from the flood of other titles in the same genre, much like the original game stood out from a sea of platformers back in the 80s. Bionic Commando took place 10 years after the events of Rearmed. During that time, a string of terrible events had taken a toll on Nathan Spencer. Gone was his cartoonish bright red hair, cheesy sunglasses, and snarky wisecracking personality, replaced with a new dreadlock haircut and a now defeated and untrusting personality. Joseph Super Joe Gibson also returned, but now in a very reversed role. Spencer had been locked away in prison for 5 years, his bionic arm taken away, and was scheduled to be executed after being betrayed by his government. These events that led to his imprisonment and betrayal were expanded on in a comic book released called Bionic Commando Chain of Command. After a massive explosion took place nearly wiping out Ascension City, Super Joe halted Spencer's execution and sent him into the city along with his bionic arm to investigate and hopefully stop whoever was behind the attack. Characters like Gottfried Groder returned from Rearmed, and new ones like the bionic Jane Magdalene and Spencer's wife Emily were added. Grin and Capcom rewarded owners of Bionic Commando Rearmed by letting them replace Nathan Spencer's new dramatically different character look with the classic, more familiar sunglass-sporting 80s design, along with some other bonuses. Probably the most surprising addition was a dedicated jump button, a feature that had remained absent from the series since its first game over 2 decades ago, and one that had become quite possibly its main defining trait. Spencer could now leap into the air and then shoot out his bionic arm. He would have full 3D control to swing in whichever direction he chose, and could even propel himself up the sides of buildings and pull himself quickly to the ground. As he moved through the air though, he would need to aim where he wanted to grapple onto, adding an extra layer of challenge and control to his movements. Much like in Rearmed, he now had more versatility with his bionic arm. Over the course of the game's story, many new abilities could be unlocked, like being able to grab and throw enemies and objects, performing a massive falling punch called Death from Above, punching debris into the air which could then be flung at enemies, and quickly pulling himself into a foe using his arm with a zip kick. The game was not without its share of frustrations, with radiation zones being the most infuriating new addition. The explosion that went off in Ascension City caused radiation to spread throughout the area. If Spencer remained in these irradiated spots, he would quickly lose health over time and eventually perish. The game's stages often looked to be quite open and accommodating for Spencer to explore and navigate, but these radiation zones meant one wrong turn was nearly instant death. These were most likely placed by the development team to restrict the player to a more linear path, but often led to countless cheap deaths if the player made an accidental wrong turn. or attempted to explore their surroundings too much. With its genre switch to a third-person shooter, Bionic Commando placed a much greater emphasis on shooting and aiming. While all of the previous games in the series had a focus on weapon combat, enemies could now attack from any angle. Spencer would need to avoid bullets and blasts, collect ammo, and carefully aim at the enemies around him, often while traversing quickly using his bionic arm. Around this time in the video game industry, it was common for many companies to tack on online multiplayer modes to help market their titles, as well as give them additional replayability, and Bionic Commando would be no exception. The game's online multiplayer had pretty standard run-of-the-mill types of gameplay modes, including Deathmatch, Team Deathmatch, and Capture the Flag. Up to 10 players could compete against each other, searching for various weapons from the game scattered about each map as they attempted to get kills and complete objectives. Bionic Commando launched first in Western territories in May of 2009 for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. It hit Japanese store shelves the following month in June of 2009, and then made its way to PCs later that same year. Much like the tone of Bionic Commando had been the polar opposite of Rearmed, so too were its review scores. Most critics were not impressed by the title and gave it generally average to poor ratings. Many disliked its cheap use of the radiation areas, banal gunplay, nonsensical story, and uninspired multiplayer, though most agreed that its swinging mechanics were actually implemented pretty well. Bionic Commando sold only 27,000 copies total in the US during its first month at retail, a paltry number next to Rearmed's 130,000 copies sold in its first week. Strangely, Capcom currently has the game listed as selling 1.3 million copies worldwide as of 2022, though it's unclear whether or not this includes Rearmed's sales as well. Only a few months after Bionic Commando had launched, Grin would close its doors, ceasing all development after most of their recent AAA releases had underperformed, with its founders citing the closure due to quote-unquote an unbearable cash flow situation. The game's poor sales and reviews even soured Capcom Japan, prompting them to completely reconsider and reevaluate their relationships and use of Western developers. Inafune and Judd both left Capcom not long after this, and ended up working together once more on the Mega Man's spiritual successor, Mighty No. 9. With Bionic Commando's most recent entry being both a critical and commercial flop, many assumed that the franchise was now truly dead. These assumptions would be proven wrong though, and Capcom showed fans that they weren't done with the series quite yet. Even though Bionic Commando had not performed well at all for Capcom, its predecessor, Bionic Commando Rearmed, had. What many were not aware of after Grin had gone under and the series seemingly received its death sentence was that a sequel to the successful remake had already been in development for a few months at the now defunct Swedish studio. Capcom cared little about continuing its expensive 3D AAA reboot, but were still quite keen on doing a sequel to its smaller, more popular counterpart. With Grin shutting down, it was decided that work would move to another Swedish studio called Fat Shark, which had taken in some of Grin's old employees who had already been working on Rearmed's sequel, aptly titled Bionic Commando Rearmed 2. Simon Wiklund would move over to Fat Shark as the creative advisor and music composer for the project, while Anders de Jager served as its creative director. Fans were quite surprised when the title was announced at April 2010's Capcom Captivate event. What surprised them even more was the inclusion of a jump button, just like Bionic Commando's 2009 3D entry had added. With this title being a completely original game from the ground up instead of a remake, the team didn't want to rely on staying true to the NES game this time and was more willing to make some big changes and do their own thing. Rearmed 2 was developed using Grin's diesel engine once again and had a very similar graphical style to its previous outing. Its story took place between the events of Rearmed and the 3D reboot, with the game's tone feeling more like a combination of the two. a dictator named General Sabio threatened to attack the FSA, or Federal States of America, with a large-scale missile attack. The FSA had sent in Colonel Brubaker and his squad to stop Sabio, but mysteriously lost contact with them. A once again redesigned mustache-sporting Nathan Spencer and his team of Bionics were sent in to find them and complete the Colonel's mission. The ability to jump wasn't the only thing that would be added or changed in Rearmed's sequel. Pressing the jump button now was what detached Spencer's arm while swinging, allowing him to toss himself over gaps and obstacles. This change let him build swing momentum at will without having to detach and reattach his arm, leading to very different and unfamiliar gameplay for classic Bionic Commando veterans. The death from above falling bionic punch ability returned from the 2009 3D Bionic Commando, along with being able to slide down walls and a new scanning ability which lets Spencer view information about on-screen enemies and contraptions, often giving hints on how to deal with them. He could also participate in sniping in helicopter segments where the player would need to aim an on-screen reticle and shoot at enemies, possibly a callback to the sniping sections from the Game Boy Color's Bionic Commando Elite Forces. Additional gameplay options were opened up by new equipable active and passive skills, like an attachable grenade launcher, health and ammo regeneration, and a close-range uppercut. Both challenge rooms and local multiplayer would return in this sequel, though multiplayer now only included co-op, axing the competitive mode found in the previous game. The overhead navigation map also received the axe, with the title opting for a more linear level-by-level progression, though completed stages could still be revisited to obtain previously inaccessible items. Bionic Commando Rearmed 2 released digitally for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 exclusively in Western regions in February of 2011, completely skipping a Japanese release. Unfortunately, the game received drastically lower review scores from critics than the first Rearmed, with many being quite disappointed in the decision to add a jump button, the altered swinging mechanics, and its lackluster stage design. Most critiques noted that it was not necessarily required to use the jump button to complete the game, and finishing the story even unlocked a retro difficulty mode that did away with jumping entirely. However, they still felt the unnecessary presence of the jump ability baked into the game's stage designs and mechanics. This pretty much solidified that a jump button had been the kiss of death for the two Bionic Commando titles that had added it, especially for the one that was trying to build on the classic 2D gameplay from the past. The sequel to Rearmed's final blunder was the anti-piracy measure included in the PS3 version of the game, that rendered it inaccessible without an internet connection, completely locking people out if the PlayStation network went down or they lost internet. Bad press around this anti-piracy measure and average to poor reviews would be the nail in the coffin for the Bionic Commando series, with Rearmed 2 being the final original title to be released, at least at this time in 2022. This wouldn't quite spell the end for Nathan Spencer and his bionic arm, however, as the character lived on in other games, and his past outings continued receiving ports throughout the years, building an unforgettable legacy that fans still continue to treasure. As they had done with so many of their other game franchises, Capcom would continue to port and license the Bionic Commando titles for many years after its 1987 debut. The original arcade game saw various conversions to computer platforms like the Amiga, the Commodore 64, DOS, the Amstrad CPC, the ZX Spectrum, and the Atari ST. The music from the arcade release was even rearranged by talented composer Tim Follin in some of these versions, who added his own spin on the tracks. Bionic Commando's arcade hit also made its way into many of Capcom's classic game collections over the years for consoles like the PS2, Xbox, PSP, and Nintendo Switch. Its popular sequel, Resurrection of Hitler Top Secret / Bionic Commando, surprisingly only ever received one direct port, potentially due to its inclusion of Hitler and his gory death scene. It was added into the Game Boy Advance's Capcom Classics Minimix collection, which also included the NES versions of Strider and Mighty Final Fight. It bizarrely also received a full novelization in 1991, published by Scholastic under their Worlds of Power video game book series. The franchise's two portable entries, Bionic Commando and Bionic Commando Elite Forces, both saw only one re-release as well on the Nintendo 3DS Virtual Console. In 2015, Capcom released a soundtrack album titled Senjo no Okami and Top Secret Original Sound Collection that combined much of the music from both series over the years. Outside of a handful of ports and merchandise, the series' legacy lived on in other Capcom titles like Zack and Wiki, Dead Rising Chop Till You Drop, Dead Rising 4, both Marvel vs. Capcom 3 games, and Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. With the series not finding much success or popularity in Japan, Spencer sadly did not get nearly as many cameos as other Capcom characters like Mega Man, Arthur, Ryu, and Morrigan. However, Spencer's unique swing movement likely influenced other classics like Super Metroid and Castlevania 4, and directly inspired indie titles such as Axiom Verge and Flint Hook. The Bionic Commando series has had a unique history which differs from almost every other video game franchise ever made. A history that saw its Western marketing slowly evolve it into something completely different than its Japanese creator Tokuro Fujiwara ever could have imagined. The franchise started its life in Japan as Top Secret, but over time adopted canonical details developed independently by various Western developers and marketing teams over the course of its long journey. Bionic Commando's early success showed that sometimes it paid to think outside of the box and do things a bit differently than everyone else, even if that meant removing a commonly accepted feature like the ability to jump. This series also taught us the important lesson that while innovation is often critical in the video game industry, sometimes sticking to a gameplay trait even years later could be equally vital. Whether or not Bionic Commando will ever swing into action once again is anyone's guess. For now, the series leaves behind a complicated legacy with a string of disjointed sequels that somehow kept clawing their way back onto video game consoles despite Capcom's reluctance. Hey, thanks so much for watching all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm a giant Bionic Commando fan. The NES game is easily one of my favorite games of all time, so this was a lot of fun for me to put together and research. I still remember beating the game at my friend's house like years and years ago and seeing Hitler's head explode and both of us just like freaking out and being completely just like, this is the coolest thing ever, you know, when you're kids, like dumb stuff like that, you know, makes us so happy. But yeah, this video was a blast to make, and I just kind of wanted to go over a couple things that didn't quite make the script and got the axe. So probably the most interesting thing is the main theme for Bionic Commando, which is actually the Stage 2 theme from Bionic Commando Arcade, composed by Harumi Fujita. And a lot of people don't know, but the actual theme in that game is actually like a minute longer than the one that people are familiar with in the NES game. Also, a lot of the European advertisements were billed as Bionic Commandos, plural, though I couldn't quite find it actually making it into the games themselves, but it was kind of interesting to see that they had the wrong title when they were marketing the game over in Europe. I think both for the arcade and many of the PC ports, which is kind of crazy. So a couple of changes I didn't talk about that happened between Resurrection of Hitler, the Famicom version of Bionic Commando, to the localized version that came west. One of the characters was named Schwarzenegger, obviously after Arnold Schwarzenegger, and that was changed to a different name for obvious reasons. And the crucifix, the pendant, was still left intact oddly, and Nintendo was generally very strict about the religious tones being removed, so it's very bizarre that that was left in. As for the 2009 Bionic Commando, popular singer/vocalist Mike Patton, who sang with the band, most famously Faith No More, actually provides the voice for Nathan Spencer, which I thought was pretty cool. And I think that game is not as bad as everybody makes it out to be. It's far from a perfect game, but I still think it has a lot of fun to be had if you'll give it a chance and kind of learn the mechanics a bit. I also wanted to share the lunchbox I got for pre-ordering the 2009 Bionic Commando, which I thought was really cool. It's one of my favorite things that I own. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and look forward to more, hopefully, in the future. Thanks so much.